In this video, we're going to give you a guide to the interface of Vectric's Aspire software. Aspire has a very similar interface and workflow to vCarve Pro. So if you're already a vCarve Pro user moving to Aspire, then you're going to find a lot of it very familiar. When we first open the program, as you can see on the left here, we have some options available to us. The first is to create a new file. The second is to open an existing Aspire file. And the third here is a list of our 4 most recently opened files to give us quick access to those. Here, let's go ahead and click on the option to create a new file. If we're creating a new job like this, we need to tell the software some information about the size of our job, where we're planning to set the datum on the machine, the XYZ0 position, what units we're working in, and also in Aspire what resolution we're going to work at if we're creating some 3D components. Finally, we have the choice of different materials that our 3D view will be shaded in. Once we've set those parameters, we go ahead and hit OK, and we go into the main interface of the program. The main icons and functions are accessed through the various tabs that we have in the software, and we're going to look at navigating around those in a moment. Also, we can access functions through the drop-down menus at the top of the interface. These are pretty standard in most Windows programs, and if we come up the top here, you can see we can select these different words. If I click on them, then I get a menu that drops down, which has options that are related to the word on the main toolbar here. Also, within these menus, you'll find that some of them have these side arrows, this little right-hand pointing arrow, and that will have sub-menus that relate to the main item in the list here. For instance, the preview simulation quality we could change to best by clicking on the option there, and that's just going to improve the quality of how my part looks when I preview the toolpaths. As I said before though, the main way that you're typically going to access the functions in the software is through the icons and options that are available on the different tabs. Currently, and by default, we always have the drawing tab displayed when we first open the software or open a new file. You can see that on the left here, and you can see at the bottom the drawing tab is selected. You'll also notice that there are 4 other tabs that we can choose here that all relate to the design process. The Drawing tab covers all the 2D design functions. The Modeling tab, which if I click on there will be selected, covers all the 3D design functions. Then we have a tab for helping us access 3D models that are on the disk that we can drag into our design in Aspire, called the 3D Clip Art tab. And finally, our Layers tab. The Layers tab helps me to organise 2D objects in the software, and you'll see that demonstrated throughout the different tutorials. Let me click back on the Drawing tab here. And let's now look at some of the functions available on each of these tabs. On the Drawing tab at the top, we have various administrative functions to help us load and import data, Windows operations like cut, copy, paste, undo and redo. We have various icons that help us control the 2D view. We have access to a small version of the Layer Manager. Now that's the same list that you saw me access through the Layers tab here. It's just a shorter amount of data displayed, and we don't have the ability to reorganize the order there. But as you're drawing and creating your data, having this quick access can be quite helpful. Below that we have our drawing icons, and then below that we have all the icons that relate to editing 2D objects like vectors and the 2D preview for our 3D components. At the very bottom of the Drawing tab, the software reminds me of our job dimensions. That can be quite a useful way to quickly check if you're working on something and you want to make sure that these dimensions are correct. If we click on the Modeling tab, we can see that the first set of icons here are all to do with drawing and editing 3D objects, or components as we call them within Aspire. Next we have the same set of 2D view control icons, and we'll take a look at those in a moment. And then we have some of the transform tools. Now these repeat some of the tools that we have on the Drawing tab, but these are to give you access to those tools when you're working with the 3D objects. For instance, you may still want to move, size and mirror a 3D object, and so it's useful to have access to these icons on the Modeling tab as well as to have access to them on the Drawing tab too. Below that we have an area where our different 3D component objects will be displayed as we create them. This is called the component tree, as is labelled here. In a moment I'll open a part that has some data in so we can see exactly how this works. Just to reiterate, The 3D Clip Art tab allows me to navigate on the disk of my PC, and within a folder, if it finds 3D Clip Art files, then it'll display those for me, and I can click and drag these into the main window. If I wanted to drag that model of the anchor there, I can just click and drag it, and now we can see that displayed there in the 2D and 3D view, which we'll look at a bit more in a moment. I'm just going to delete that for the moment. And then again, the Layers tab at the end here, this shows me all these layers that I can use to organize my 2D objects. And as I mentioned before, this is just a longer, more detailed view of the same thing that we can access from the Drawing tab by clicking on the drop down here. Once we've created our 2D and 3D design elements, then we're going to want to calculate toolpaths. The toolpaths are the data that we're actually going to save to run on the CNC machine to carve our part. The Toolpaths tab by default is over on the right hand side of the interface. You can see up in the top right here there is a little tab that says Toolpaths. If I hover the mouse over that, the Toolpaths tab will pop out, and I can use this pin icon here to pin that in place. At the very top of the Toolpaths tab, it'll display a reminder as to what our material setup is. This is what we specified in the job setup, but before we calculate a toolpath, you should always double check this, and really it's good practice to hit the set button, come into here and edit any of the values in here that you may want to change before you commit to your size and position that you're going to calculate the actual data that you're going to run on your CNC. Once you're happy with that, you can hit OK. Then within the main part of the icons on the toolpath operations here, we have our first 3 rows all dedicated to different toolpath strategies. The first row is what we call 2D toolpath strategies like profile, pocket and drill. The second row is 2.5D toolpath strategy like V-carving, texturing and prism carving. And the third row is our 3D strategies. Here we have 3D roughing and 3D finishing, and we'll use those to cut the 3D model. Below that, various administrative tools like the ability to edit, copy, delete and recalculate toolpaths. On the next line, access to the tool database, which is where we specify our tool information that we can use in the different toolpaths, and also access to the toolpath templates. Then on the last row here, we have the ability to preview our toolpaths, which allows us to animate them in a virtual piece of material, get an estimate for how long they're going to take to cut, and most importantly, the ability to save the toolpath. That's what we're going to do when we're finally happy with that and we know we're ready to output it and format it in a way that our machine tool will be able to understand it and cut it for us. At the base of the Toolpath tab, we have our toolpath list. Once we actually start to calculate toolpaths, this list will be populated with the names that the toolpaths we've made, and we'll be able to select from the list and then execute the different operations that we can on them, such as the preview, the copy, or maybe saving it out and post-processing it for the machine. So we've seen how we can access the different functions within the software by using these tabs and clicking on the icons within them. But where our design is actually going to take shape is within the central workspace here in what we call the 2D and the 3D views. These are accessed from these 2 tabs at the top here. Currently, and by default when we first open the file, you'll be able to see the 2D view. This is where we do our vector layout. This is where we create the basics for our design. Then once we've calculated toolpaths, or if we're doing 3D modeling, we'll be able to see the result of that in the 3D view. In here, you've essentially got like a 3-dimensional virtual representation of your job. In a moment, we'll open a file that has some data in it so you can see more clearly exactly how the 2D view and the 3D view work together. As I said, to navigate between these, we can just click on the tabs here, or we have actually got shortcut keys in the software we can use. If we hit the function key F2, that will maximize the 2D view. If we hit the function key F3, that will select the 3D view and display the contents to us. I'm just going to hit F2 again to go back to the 2D view. So let's go ahead now and open a part that has some 2D vectors, 3D components and toolpaths all created within it, and see how these are displayed within the software and also how we can navigate around the 2D and 3D views. Let's come over and click on File Open. I'm going to open an example file here, which is actually one of the ones we run through in the tutorials. And then we can see now that we've come in, we've got the 2D view, and within here there is different types of data displayed to us. This grayscale, if I click on it, is actually a 2D representation of a 3D model. If we go over and click in the 3D view, we can see that 3D model shown to us here, and I can rotate that around in order to be able to look at it within the 3D view. We'll talk more about this manipulation of the 3D view in a moment. If I come back to the 2D view, I can also see a vector here which we've got around the perimeter of our part. If we click and use the drop down, I can see that I've got a selection of layers within here that I've organized my data onto. At the moment we have one called components that contains this outline vector and the grayscale for my 3D part. If I was to undraw that by clicking on the light bulb, that will disappear, and you can see that there are other different vectors that we've used to construct the part on these other different layers. So you can see how the layers can be used to organize data within the software. If I close this and we look on the Layers tab, we can see the same set here, but now we'd also have access to being able to reorder those if we wanted by using the arrows here. I have various tools within the software to help me navigate around the 2D view. By default, we're in what we call selection mode. That's indicated to me by the hard Y arrow that you see on the screen representing my mouse cursor. There are other modes that we can go into though in order to manipulate the view. If we come over to the 2D view control, the first option is pan. If I click on this, I can get this four-way arrow that you can see now instead of that single white arrow that we had before, and I can click anywhere within the 2D view and move this around in order to look at a different area of the job. This is particularly useful when you're zoomed in on one area of the part. As well as the pan, I can always use these scroll bars as well at the bottom and the side in order to move around within the view as well. When I want to exit out of the pan mode, I can either hit escape on the keyboard or I can come down and just click on the arrow here under edit objects to go back into my standard selection mode. Standard selection mode is where I can just click in the 2D view in order to select different objects. The next three icons under 2D view control let me access different zoom functions. The first one, if I click on it, will change the cursor into this magnifying glass, and what this allows me to do if I want is to click, hold the mouse down, drag a box and zoom in on a particular area of the part. And I can keep zooming in on closer and closer areas so I can get to a really microscopic view. If I want to exit out of this zoom mode, then I can come over, click on the selection mode arrow, or again I could hit the escape key on the keyboard. If I want to go back so I can see all of my job, then I use the next icon which fits my workspace within the window so we can see it. That's a useful one to remember because that'll always let you get back to a view where you can see everything in your part. The final of our three zoom icons under 2D view control lets me zoom on the selected object. So what I'll do is I'll just switch on some smaller pieces of data so that we can demonstrate that. I'm just going to come into the drop down for the layers here. I'm going to switch off the components layer, switch on the other layers we've got here. I'll hit close. Now if we wanted to, we could select the vector for the face here, and I could come over and click on the icon to zoom the selected object, and it'll just fit that object into my 2D view, into the window here, so that we're zoomed in close on it. That would allow me to then work on this if I wanted, and then we could go back and just say zoom to fit, and we'd be back out to our standard view. As well as the icons to zoom in and out of the 2D view, if your mouse has a wheel in the centre of it, you can also use that to dynamically zoom. For instance, if I wanted to zoom in on the foot here, I can move my mouse down to that area and I can just roll the mouse wheel away from me in order to zoom in, or I can roll the mouse wheel towards me in order to zoom out. If you kind of get lost within the zooming, remember you can always come up and click on the icon to zoom to fit. Another way of accessing some functions in the 2D view is what we call the context-sensitive menus. These are accessed by clicking the right mouse key on your mouse. If I click on it now, you'll see I get a selection of options, and these are relevant to the current situation my part is in and where my cursor is located. Just to give you an example of that, if we were to select this vector here and I was to go into what we call node editing mode, which lets me see the individual constituent parts of a vector, Now, depending where my mouse is over the different parts of the vector will depend on what menu I see when I right mouse click. For instance, if we move the cursor so we're over a node, you'll see it changes so that it's displaying a crosshair. If I right mouse click now, you'll see I'll get various options, and these are specific to commands that I can execute only on that specific node that I was over. If I was to be over a span, which is the area in between the nodes, and I right mouse click, then I get a different selection of choices here of functions that apply specifically to that span. For instance, if we wanted to turn that into a line, then I would just click on that option here, and you can see it's edited that vector. We can always come up and hit on the undo command to go back from there. So this context-sensitive menu is very important. One other characteristic of this and all the drop-down menus that you see in the software is that on the right here we display a letter, or it may be a combination of keys that you can press on the keyboard to access this function. In this case, if I wanted to delete that point there, I don't necessarily need to do the right mouse click to access this command. I could just hit the D key on the keyboard as long as the cursor was in the right place, and that command would be executed. And this is just a way you can help speed up your work process within the software as you start to learn some of these shortcut keys. So to exit out of our node editing mode we're in, I'm going to come over again and click on the selection mode arrow here. And now I want to look at our 3D view and some of the things associated with that. So let's come up and click on the tab here to go into the 3D view. Here you can see the model that's been created in this part. And if we go over and click on the modeling tab, we can see that we've actually got a couple of different things now in the component tree. This comprises of one object which is currently switched off and one object which is currently switched on. If I click on the check mark there, we can see that undisplay or display that particular object. Now these actually are comprised of multiple components. This little plus here shows me that there's actually a group of components here. If I click on the plus, we can see all the subcomponents that make up that group. If I wanted to, I could undraw the main finished version of the model here, and I could click this on and we could see all these different components that we created in order to get to that final result. Let's just go ahead and switch off our group again, switch back on the finished part there. One thing to note is if you do select a component in the list here, it will be shaded in red within the 3D view, so it makes it easier to see what's going on. As well as selecting components from the list, we can also double click in the 3D view in order to select a component. So if you have a long list of components and perhaps you're not sure from the names which is which, you can always come into the 3D view here, double click, and that will select it and also highlight the name in the component tree. There is also one context-sensitive menu available in the 3D view. If we have an object selected and then within the 3D view we double right mouse click on it, you can see we get a selection of options for adjusting the combine mode for that and also adjusting which components are shown, as well as accessing the properties for it. That can be quite useful again if you want to work within the 3D view and access these functions rather than coming over and clicking on the icons to access them. Like the 2D view, we have various ways of navigating our way around the 3D view to highlight the area we want to look at. To zoom in and out, we can use the mouse wheel again, as we could do in the 2D view, rolling it away from us zooms in, rolling it towards us zooms out, or we can also use the right hand mouse key. If we press that down and move it away from us, it zooms in. If we move it towards us, it zooms out. So if your mouse doesn't have a wheel, you can still zoom in and out the 3D view by using the right mouse key and moving the mouse back and forward. The 3D view will always zoom in on what's in the center of our screen, so it's also useful to know how to pan the 3D view. To do this, we hold the left mouse key and the right mouse key down simultaneously and then move the mouse in order to pan it. So if we want to zoom in on the head, we need to pan that to the center, then right mouse click and zoom in order to zoom in on the object there. If I want to get that back to the standard zoom, I can click on this icon up here, which is zoom to fit, which will just fit my part back into the 3D view window. We also have other view icons up the top here. I can view the ISO view that we're in at the moment, down the Z-axis, down the X-axis, or down the Y-axis in order to look at the part from different angles. If we go back to the ISO view here, I also have the ability to click with the left mouse key and move the mouse around in order to rotate the view to an angle of my own choosing. I can just click and drag this, and you can see that we can pretty much get to look at any aspect of the job we want to. Right mouse click to zoom in, left and right mouse keys to pan that around. And it's worth practicing these so you get familiar with them, because it'll really help you to see what's going on when you start to create 3D models within the software. In addition to seeing our 3D components within the 3D view, we also can see the toolpaths drawn there as well. If I come over and click on the icon here to switch to Toolpaths tab, that'll hide my design tabs over on the left here. On the right here it'll open the Toolpaths tab, and at the bottom you can see we have 3 toolpaths calculated that are displayed in the toolpath list. Currently these are not drawn. If I wanted to, I can click on the box at the top here to draw them all, or if I click that to undraw them again, I may just want to show one of these at a time. There we can see the roughing, the finishing toolpath, and finally a cutout profile toolpath there. As well as seeing the individual lines of each toolpath as we did by drawing them here, I can also preview my toolpaths in the 3D view. This actually animates the tool following the path that we've calculated through a virtual piece of material, so it shows me a really good representation of what I'm actually going to cut on the machine. If we come up and click on the preview icon here, we can take a look at this. You can see we now have this flat piece of material being displayed in whatever rendering choice I've made up the top here. I can come and we'll select the roughing and say preview that toolpath, and what the software will do is actually show me what that toolpath is going to look like when I cut it. Next I could take the finishing and preview that, so now it's taking the actual tool that we've chosen and showing me what detail I'm going to get on my 3D model when we actually run this on the CNC machine. Really invaluable to make sure that I don't waste time or material on something that isn't going to work. Finally, if we want to look at the cutout, I can say preview the selected toolpath. We can see how that looks, and if we want to, we can remove the excess stock around the outside here just by double clicking on it. If I come in here and double click on that small piece there and double click on the part on the outside, this is exactly the part that we should get on our CNC machine if we set everything up correctly to match what we've done within the software. Now, understanding how to orient the 3D view is useful here, because if I can rotate, zoom and pan this into the position I want, I'm able to come over and click on the button to save a preview image here, and that would allow me to take a snapshot of what I can see on the screen, save it as something like a JPEG that I could email to a customer in order to show them what their part's going to look like. Let's just come down and hit close. On the preview form here, we'll go back into the standard 3D view where we can see our component displayed that we modelled. And now let me show you one last thing before we finish this presentation, and that's how you can see both the 2D view and the 3D view at the same time. If I come up and click on the icon here to hide the Toolpaths tab and open back up our design tabs again, we have a couple of icons we can use under 2D view control to tile the windows. The first one tiles the windows vertically. That means when I click that, I see the 2D view on the left and the 3D view on the right. And the other icon tiles the windows horizontally, so I see the 2D view on the top and the 3D view on the bottom. And this can be a really useful way to work because it's easy for me to select objects, see what's going on in the 2D view, but also as I create 3D components or calculate toolpaths, I can see the result of those happening in the 3D view simultaneously. In addition, we could also pop out the Toolpaths tab if we wanted, pin that into place, come over, click on the icon again to tile the windows, and you can see we can actually configure the interface if we have enough screen real estate, so we can see all our drawing and modelling icons, all our toolpath icons over on the right here, the 2D and the 3D view as well. If you're working with a really large screen or perhaps with a dual monitor setup, it's also worth noting that the icon tabs can be torn off and positioned into a new place on the interface, not necessarily within the software window itself. If I come over here and click on the modelling tab at the top, I can drag this over, and now you can see this is a free floating window where I have access to my different icons, and even each of these could be separately torn off and used individually as well. If I just click and bring that over, we can drag that back into place. As you're learning the program though, we'd recommend not reconfiguring the interface, because within the software videos you're going to see us go into the icons and the positions of these different tabs in their default places. This is a nice feature though as you become used to the program if you want to configure the interface in order to fit your particular setup on your monitor. So there you've had a quick guide to where all the key functions are within the software and how to navigate between the different sets of icons and within the 2D and 3D view. The Aspire interface is very flexible, and you'll find that as you learn the software that the workflow between these different tabs makes it very intuitive. For instance, you always know if you want to draw something or edit something in the 2D view as part of your design, you're going to come over to the Drawing tab. If you're working on a 3D model, you'll be on the Modeling tab. When you're calculating Toolpaths, you'll be over on the Toolpaths tab. And even within those, there's a lot of organisation as well that'll become clear as you work through the tutorials. That concludes this particular video.